When The Souls of Black Folk was published in 1903, Du Bois created something entirely new in American letters. At 35 years old, working as a professor of sociology at Atlanta University, Du Bois wrote a book that would become the most important text in African American intellectual history. What makes the book remarkable is its refusal to fit into any single category. It mixes autobiography, sociology, history, political criticism, cultural observation, and fiction. This mixing was not accidental. Dubois deliberately challenged the dominant way of doing scholarship in his time, which insisted that researchers should be completely objective and detached from their subjects. He believed this approach was dishonest when studying race and oppression. White scholars who claimed to be neutral observers could never truly understand the lives of black Americans. To understand something as deep as racial oppression, you must acknowledge your own position in the system. You cannot stand outside the color line and claim to see clearly. The book moves between personal testimony and scientific analysis because Dubois believed that both were necessary. The personal reveals what statistics cannot capture, while statistics reveal patterns that individual stories might miss. The opening words of the book contain his most famous claim. The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. This was not simply about the American South. He saw the color line as a global system that structured all of modern civilization. The same logic that justified slavery in America also justified colonialism in Africa and Asia. When European powers claimed they were bringing civilization to backward peoples, he saw the ugly truth underneath. The color line was a mechanism for exploiting human beings and treating them as raw materials for economic profit. The suffering of black sharecroppers in rural Georgia was directly connected to the suffering of colonized peoples across the world. To understand the condition of black life under the color line, Dubois developed two interconnected concepts: the veil and double consciousness. The veil works on three levels. First, it is the physical barriers of segregation, the laws and customs that separate black and white worlds. Second, it distorts how each race sees the other, creating mutual blindness. White people cannot see black people as fully human, and black people are forced to see themselves through the distorted lens of white racism. Third, the veil restricts knowledge, making the inner lives and achievements of black Americans invisible to the dominant culture. Double consciousness flows directly from life behind the veil. Dubois described it as this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. Black American is split between two identities, being American and being Negro. These identities are presented by the dominant culture as mutually exclusive. This splitting causes deep psychological pain, the constant struggle to reconcile two warring ideals within one body. Yet, Dubois saw something potentially valuable in this condition. This second sight gives black Americans a unique critical perspective because they must navigate both inside and outside the dominant ideology. They can see the deep contradictions of American democracy more clearly than those who benefit from the racial privilege. The alienation of double consciousness, when transformed into self-conscious awareness, becomes a source of insight and resistance. In the third chapter, Dubois launches a devastating critique of Booker T. Washington, then the most powerful black leader in America. Washington's strategy asked black Americans to give up demands for voting rights, civic equality, and higher education. Instead, he urged them to focus on industrial training, farming, and property accumulation, believing that economic success would eventually break down white prejudice. Dubois saw this as a disastrous compromise that reinforced white supremacy. He traced three terrible developments directly to Washington's influence: the removal of black voting rights across the South, the legal codification of second class citizenship, and the withdrawal of support for black colleges. Dubois argued that Washington's program contained an impossible contradiction. A people cannot protect their economic interests if they surrender their political rights. Economic success requires the protection of the ballot. Industrial efficiency requires educated minds, and thrift cannot flourish in an atmosphere of degradation. In response, Dubois defended the liberal arts education against the narrow focus on industrial training. Education should not merely produce efficient workers. Its true goal is to develop human souls, to create people capable of independent thought and moral judgment. This brought Dubois to his theory of the talented tenth, the idea that social progress requires cultivating an intellectual elite among the oppressed population. The talented tenth would not be a detached aristocracy but a vanguard with a deep sense of responsibility toward their community. They would teach, build institutions, organize resistance, and translate the community's needs into effective political action. Dubois examines Dougherty County, Georgia, in the heart of the Black Belt to show how the end of slavery created a new system of economic exploitation. The freed people were released without land, capital, or credit. They were forced to rent land from white landowners through the crop lane system, which kept them in permanent debt through inflated prices and fraudulent accounting. The legal system reinforced this economic trap. Vagrancy laws, contract enforcement acts, and the convict lease system criminalized black economic independence and turned any attempt to self-determination into a crime. The spatial organization of the plantations kept black people confined to isolated rural areas, cut off from education, capital, and legal protection. Dubois rejected simple explanations of racial inequality. He showed that white prejudice and black poverty reinforced each other in an endless cycle. Exclusion from employment, education, and capital accumulation forced black people into poverty, and the dominant culture then used this poverty as proof of natural inferiority. Breaking this cycle required changing both the material conditions of economic life and the ideological structures of racial caste. In the chapter Off the Wings of Atlanta, Dubois used the Greek myth of Atlanta to criticize the worship of wealth and commerce in the post-Reconstruction South. The huntress Atlanta lost a race because she stopped to pick up golden apples thrown by her suitor. Dubois warned that the South was making the same mistake, sacrificing its moral soul for industrial development. For black Americans, this meant accepting industrial training at the expense of spiritual and intellectual life. He insisted that a civilization should be measured not by its industrial output but by its capacity for ethical ideals and artistic expression. Black church serves as the primary social organization within the veil. The preacher emerges as a leader in the absence of political power. The music provided collective expression, and the ecstatic frenzy of worship offered emotional release from the crushing pressures of oppression. Dubois identifies two ethical responses within black religious life. The Southern tradition emphasizes patience and otherworldly salvation, while the Northern tradition produces bitterness and despair. Negro spirituals are identified by Dubois as the only true Native American music. He elevates these slave songs to the highest level of human art, challenging the racist assumptions that dismiss them as primitive minstrelsy. The songs captured the trauma of slavery while maintaining hope in ultimate justice. Dubois concludes by emphasizing that American culture is not exclusively Anglo Saxon. Black Americans contributed story, song, physical labor, and spiritual gifts to the nation's foundation. Dubois' book stands as both a diagnosis of racial oppression and a vision of a unified culture where these contributions are recognized and honored.